All right. Evening, everyone. Welcome to another, please be seated if you're standing, Peaceful Solution Teachers Certification Training Course. And welcome back. Welcome back. Hope everybody made it here and didn't leave any of their melting body parts on the way up here. It's pretty hot. I was thinking today it's hot here in Texas when you go to wash your hands and you turn on the cold water and then you have to turn on the hot water to cool it down. The water's that hot coming out of the ground. But that's summertime for you, and it seems like it's increasingly getting hotter and hotter. And we'll get into a little bit of some of these causes as we move forward, especially once we get kind of into chapter 7 here. If we cover that, and understanding how the choices of mankind affects the environment around them. And what we're talking about is self-control and maintaining it, because the choices that we make or that young people make, remember we're directing us towards young men and women between the ages of 11 and 13. The choices that they make in this age range, we're going to see some of these things from some of the articles that we have today to support the material that we're continuing to cover in regards to the drugs and the premarital sex and the alcohol and so forth. There's a demographic of young people who are more susceptible to these things. And when you take into consideration what we covered, in chapter 2, controlling your emotions to your advantage, and, this time period in the young people's lives where they're going through physical changes, emotional changes, hormonal changes, going through puberty and so forth. They've got a whole slew of things just to go through and deal with and try to figure out. And then you add some of these things, which we've been talking about for the last several classes, into the mix of it. That adds an even deeper level of confusion that could be hard to bring a person back out of once they've gone so deep. Not impossible, but it can be very difficult. Well, our goal is to try to kind of stem that deep dive into confusion, so to speak, before the student gets there. And right now, it's a monumental task that lies ahead of us, but it's not an impossible task, and that's what we want to keep in mind. So we're going to continue here in chapter 5. This is maintaining your self-control, and we're going to be picking up on page 142. But before we get started, I want to go back to lesson plan 5, page E, and just kind of rehash here where William left off, and to get our minds back on track to where we are going to be continuing today. And we're going to look at procedure 8, lesson plan 5, page E, procedure 8. And it says, tell students that just like other influences, so we're talking about influences here, alcohol, drugs, if a person is weaving all over the road and the officer pulls them over, and smells inside the car and realizes there's something, kind of funny going on, and they're actually ends up being cited for, being intoxicated, and they get a DUI. Well, one of the names of that is DUI is driving under the influence, right? Or DWI is not driving while intoxicated, but DUI is a driving under the influence, and that could be of several things, right? It could be the influence of any type of drug, marijuana or cocaine, or it could be under the influence of another substance, alcohol and so forth. But it's an influence, and that's the point that we want to get our students to understand, is that these things that we're talking about here are influences. They affect the way we think, we feel, and we act. And anything that affects those things, that they have the ability to affect our decision-making process, our values, and in effect, change our character. They could affect our character, right? And so if a person's not equipped with the knowledge to differentiate and to recognize a positive influence from a negative influence, then they're going to typically go with what feels great, right? This feels like a good thing here. This feels fun. okay? But something that feels good or feels fun is not always healthy. It's not always beneficial. It's not always moral, okay? So we want to get our students to the point where they're always thinking in their mind, not just short term, not the immediate effect, but what is the long-term effect of me making this decision to participate in this particular activity? Somebody's offering me a joint or a cigarette or a glass of alcohol, or I don't even know what's in the glass. You got to be careful, like William said in the previous class, they slip some of these things in people's drinks, and it could be a non-alcoholic drink, right? You go to some of these parties, these young people go to these parties because they want to, remember, this is a time period in the young person's life where they're seeking acceptance outside of the home, outside of the family. They're tired of mom and dad, they're old-fashioned, they don't know what fun is, and my little brother and sister, they're boring, I don't want to hang out with them, I want to hang out with people my age. I want to get out and have some fun, stretch my legs, spread my wings, and so forth, and then they go to these parties and they end up getting roofied, the date rape drug and so forth. And I think Rohypnol might be one of the names of them. And in some cases where it goes that bad, they do end up getting raped. And this is not only the case for women or young women, but also for young men as well. So tell students that just like other influences, peer pressure can be both positive and negative. Have students turn to page 138, which we covered this in the previous classes, and read the section. There are two sides to every coin, and emphasize that risk-taking behavior is a result of a lack of self-control. And like William mentioned in the previous classes on some of these people who actually go out and engage in risk-taking behavior, seeking acceptance, seeking popularity. Now these aren't necessarily 10 and 11 and 13-year-olds. These are what society would classify as adults, right? Supposedly rational thinking adults who are going out and deliberately engaging in risk-taking behavior, all for the purpose of getting more likes, getting more viewers, getting more subscribers, and kind of the bottom line for a lot of them, getting more money in their bank account. And many of them have lost their lives as a result of this. You don't get a second opportunity when you lose your life. You go out and you engage in some of these risk-taking behaviors, and you don't get a second opportunity. Sometimes it might not be death. Sometimes it might be a permanent disability that someone else has to be burdened with addressing, taking care of, right? You have a child who engages in something, they go and they try a drug, or they get drunk, or they go binge drinking, as was mentioned in the previous class, and they go and get themselves in some type of an accident, right? And that accident permanently disables them to where they have to be taken care of full time for the rest of their life. It's important to impress in the mind of the students that our choices don't just affect us. They ripple outward and they affect those in our environment. And even though a parent would not desire to see their child die as a result of abusing alcohol or drugs, I think just as much they don't want to see their child suffer for the rest of their life being an invalid, being mentally disabled, not able to make decisions, because you always have a parent always has that remembrance in their mind of how they were a young, bubbly, energetic, person who was full of life, and then they look at their child now because of a bad choice, right? Being around the wrong crowd, more than likely being educated about influences and the decisions that they make, and how those decisions, they have one opportunity at that moment, that point in their life. They have the opportunity to go one way or the other with that decision. And if they go the wrong way, there is no throwing it in reverse and cranking it around and going the other way. No, you're stuck, right? And it's a challenge as teachers to try to impress that in the minds of our young people. There's probably to some degree, a little bit easier, 20 or 30 years ago, because they didn't have all these other influences that are so readily available at the fingertips that is, on the majority of a lot of young people, elementary school students, hips or book bags. They have cell phones and things like that. We talked about that. Students that aren't even in the double digits yet, they already have cell phones, and many of them have unrestricted use to those cell phones. So they have all these influences bombarding them in the time of their life where they're ill prepared to make rational, moral decisions. Okay? So, just to kind of get your mindset as a teacher of, the challenge that we're facing. We have a huge road ahead of us, but we've got the proper equipment, right? We've got the proper tools to smooth out the bumps, to fill in the pit holes, to avoid accidents and consequences that come with a lack of education and making bad choices. So emphasize that risk-taking behavior is a lack of self-control, and instruct students to turn to the section entitled Be Your Own Person, and that's going to be in a couple pages here, found on page 144. Well, we're going to be picking up on page 142, continuing in that same line of thinking, teaching that William covered, and I just want to go back and read one more time here. In our purpose and objective for this lesson, for chapter 5 here, it says, students will learn how influences can affect their ability to maintain their self-control. They will also learn how to apply self-control to distinguish between positive and negative influences, which, with that, that places in the mind that in order for them to apply self-control, to be able to distinguish between positive and negative influences, that means they have to stop and take into account the thoughts that are going through their mind as a result of those influences, or take into consideration what that influence could impress or the thought that it could bring up in their mind. Because remember, everything starts with a thought, right? It starts with a thought. An influence comes in, it creates a thought, that thought engages an emotion, and that emotion will lead to an action, okay? So having this will help them to distinguish between positive and negative influences, and to not let others bring them down to their level. All right, and that's a great statement there. Not to let someone bring you down, and it's not to look down on other people, but we're building positive character. We're building morality in our students. When people influence your students negatively or in a negative way, they're not building that positive character, they're tearing it down. They're bringing it right back down to the foundation. And what does the student have to do when they fall? Well, they've got to pick themselves up and start again. Okay, and they're going to have those challenges, I guarantee you. As a teacher, we have to reassure them of this, that you're gonna make some bad choices, you're gonna make some mistakes, you're gonna probably at times the opportunity, I guess I should say, will be there to allow your emotions to overstep your rationale, your moral thinking, and you probably will come back and realize that you made a bad choice. You made a choice based on emotions and not morality. And you'll see it and you'll fix it. But we have to be realistic. We've got to set realistic goals in the minds of our students. If we set too lofty of a goal, then it has to be baby steps. If we set too lofty of a goal for them, all of a sudden, right, if they do fall, they could become depressed. They could start thinking they're a failure, because they're looking at this tall goal over here. How am I ever going to get there? When as the teacher, it's kind of our goal to just put this step right in front of them, right? They just have to make it up this one step. Now they can focus on making it up to this next step and so forth. All right. And so, like we mentioned here, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And 1,000 miles can seem very daunting, especially if you have to walk 1,000 miles in 108-degree weather, But It's not impossible. I just looked at an article for some guy who was the first person to circumnavigate the globe. I don't think he had to navigate it, but on foot. Just him and his buddy old pal, the dog. I don't know what the dog's name was, but he walked around the globe on foot. So, 20-something thousand. Well, most of that's water, so I don't think he walked underwater or through the Marianas Trench or anything like that. But he did on the land walk around the globe. So it's possible. In fact, before there were cars and trains and automobiles and planes and so forth, that's what people did. They walked, they rode in carriages and so forth. Well, anyway, let me get off the topic there. On page 142, we see here, this is entitled Coming Full Circle. All right, Coming Full Circle. Now remember what we left off with on the previous lessons, right? The two sides to every coin, talking about peer pressure and, the effects that it can have in engaging in risk-taking behaviors, such as premarital sex, the use of illegal drugs, as well as underage thinking. And then, William kind of went a little bit into more detail about drugs and alcohol and the effects that they have on people, right? And not just for young, immature children, young men and women, but for adults as well. You can have old, immature people too, maturation or maturing, it takes time, it takes knowledge, it takes experience, okay? Just because a person is in their 30s or 40s doesn't mean they've matured, especially if they haven't received the education and the proper training to be able to mature. And I was thinking about that the other day because, and not to get off on alcohol here, but when you think about wine, and they talk about, a fine wine, right? That's aged in an oak barrel or something like that, or whatever they might age it in. I'm not sure all the things, a bottle or whatever. It's 25 years old. Well, think about it. You can have wine, which is grapes and, maybe some other ingredients, and, the yeast that comes in to start making that wine, or cheese the same way. But if you don't have the right environment, right, and think of the ingredients as the building blocks that we're learning here, right, the building blocks that we're receiving here from the Peaceful Solution. You've got to have the right ingredients, and you have to have the right environment in order for that wine to age and mature to perfection. Same thing with cheese, same thing with a lot of fermented foods and drinks, okay? Well, it's the same thing with our character. We have to have the right ingredients, and we have to have the right environment, right? Because those two things help. Remember what we covered in the character unit all the way in chapter 1, your environment helps in the shaping and the molding of your character. Okay, so you can't, take one out of the sequence and get the full benefit of it. All right, it's not to say that a person who grows up in a dysfunctional home can't take the Peaceful Solution and read it and learn. Yes, they can, right? But they could probably learn even faster and yield even stronger results in an environment that supports what they're learning and isn't constantly fighting against it. Okay, so that's just information to keep in mind there. So William talked about drugs and alcohol, and some of the reasons on page 140. Using drugs or alcohol at a young age has been attributed to many reasons, some of which are friends are doing it, right? Because friends have a very strong influence on one another. Friends are doing it. Well, my friends are doing it. I don't want to be left out. Right? I don't want to be the oddball, I'll go ahead and take a drink. What's it going to hurt? Sometimes that was the last words that the person made. What's it going to hurt? Or as they joke, hold my beer, right? And they jump off the cliff, not considering the depths of the water. The cliff's 20 foot high, but the water's only 5 foot deep, right? And that's what people do a lot of times with these things. They jump off the cliff, not taking into consideration how deep the water is, and that they're going to seriously injure themselves because friends are doing it. Well, if your friends are doing something that's immoral, and this is why we laid that foundation in the mind of the students in chapter 4 of the character unit, of the acceptance unit, right? How to choose friends. What are friends to begin with? right? A friend is not going to sit there and let you explode a mortar-style firecracker off the top of your head, as was read in the last class. You know, a friend is not going to let you, like the campaign, friends don't let friends drive drunk, right? Friends don't let friends drive drunk. Let's take it back a notch. Friends don't let friends get drunk to begin with, right? If they don't get drunk, they won't drive drunk. You can walk home drunk and fall down and hit your head on the curb and kill yourself, you know, or seriously injure somebody else. You don't have to get behind a wheel to become a danger to someone else. It's the abuse of these things. And this is something that we really have to impress in the mind of our students, because sometimes they have this false comfort in their mind, you know, oh, I'm in the car with a designated driver. You know, it's okay if I get drunk because, you know, Susie or Bobby or whoever is going to be driving us home, right? Okay, no. There's long-term effects that come with saturating your organs and your bloodstream with copious amounts of alcohol, okay? Because your body has to work to process that. Excuse me. And one of the things that people don't take into consideration is that when it comes to alcohol or any type of fluid substance like that, it's a volume. It's a volume to blood and weight and so forth as to how fast your liver can metabolize that. You put more than there that your body can metabolize, you're gonna feel the effects pretty bad, pretty quick. The next reason is attributed to reasons why some people are using drugs and alcohol is to fit in and to have a sense of belonging. And this goes right along with the first one here. Another one is curiosity. And I hate to bring this up, poor cats, but you know what they say about curiosity and what it did? It killed the cat, or severely harmed or disfigured the cat. I mean, it's, curiosity in itself is not a bad thing, because that's how people learn things, right? When you take into consideration something beneficial or positive, people want to learn a little bit more about science. They want to learn about the universe and how it works, or math, or things that are beneficial, right? How does this work, or how does that work? What are the mechanics behind this? Nothing wrong with that. But when you're inquiring to learn, not to educate yourself, but to dive in both feet to fully experience alcohol and drugs, that's not I'm a hands-on type of person experience that you need to go through, right? Well, you can tell me about cocaine, but I don't really I can't believe you until I actually snort it myself, right? Yeah, that's not the beneficial way. Experience is not the best teacher. Remember what we covered in the previous lessons? Experience is not the best teacher always. Here's another reason: low self-worth. And we'll get into a little bit more of this, because when a person has low self-worth, low self-concept, or a negative self-concept, they don't have that respect for themselves. And when there's a lack of self-respect, right, then you open yourself up to being willing to try anything, right? Being willing to do anything. Why? Because you don't have care and concern for your health and well-being. You don't have care and concern for your mind and what you want to do with it in the future, and how you need it right now to get into the future, right? So when you have a low self-worth, when you have low, unhealthy concept of yourself, well, yeah, you're more susceptible to engaging in these risk-taking behaviors. Some do it to feel grown up, to escape from problems. And this is something that, I was thinking, I think pretty much everybody has had the feeling when they were younger, I can't wait till I'm older. I can't wait till I'm an adult. I can't wait till I'm grown up, right? And I remember that, thinking that way when I was younger, but I didn't take into consideration everything that went into being an adult. I didn't take into consideration, I had to pay taxes, I have to go to work, I have to pay bills. Oh, what? You just turning on the light switch? That's not free, right? Okay. Turning on the water faucet, that's not just something that everybody gets in the community. You have to actually pay for water. You have to pay for electricity. You don't just get in the car and turn the key on and the needle automatically goes to F on the fuel gauge, right? You know, there's a lot of responsibilities that you don't really consider when you're a child because your parents are dealing with that on a daily basis. It's not really their concern at that point. But, you know, people do things to make them feel grown up, right? But it's a false perception, as William covered. It's a false perception of being grown, of being adult. You know, a real adult, a real a grown-up, you know, they have a strong moral character. They're able to have insight and foresight into things and to take careful consideration of their thoughts and their decisions before making them, because they understand that everything has consequences. Well, this is something, again, that's hard to impress in the mind of a young person because this is about as far as most young people can see, which is right there in front of their face. Being adults, we've gone that. We've been down that route. We've seen, we've done that, right? And so we're trying to help the students through our experience to help them to see, hey, you know, you don't want to make this choice. This is what it can lead to. Or, yeah, you should probably make that choice because this is what it can lead to. And these are the rewards that you can have. Another attribution for engaging in underage drinking and alcohol or drugs and alcohol is to escape from problems, which, you know, that doesn't work because the problems are still there after you come down off the high. And just following along. Well, just following along, not being our own person is what we're going to get into a little bit later here. Probably not this class, but we'll cover that in the next page or so. So let's look back over here to page 142 here, because we're talking about coming full circle. And it says, if you allow yourself to be pressured or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs, and that word abusing simply means, and it means several things, but it means the improper use of something. The improper use of something, right? You know, that's not the person, you know, I hold my glass carefully while I take my 8th drink. No, it's the improper use of it. Now, you know, we didn't go into detail about it, but William made a great point. You know, the peaceful solution is not against alcohol. Alcohol has benefits when those things are used in moderation and properly and at the appropriate age and so forth. But it's when you take those things outside of their proper use is when you have problems. You know, like a person who's just had a major invasive surgery and then they're given antibiotics and some painkillers, right? Well, they have on the side of that bottle, use as directed, use as prescribed, right? If there are any concerns or any problems, they always say, consult a physician, consult your healthcare professional, and so forth. But they directly tell you to use it as directed. Okay? When you go outside of that and just start popping pills in grandma or grandpa's cupboard or mother or father's cupboard because you want to get that experience of that loftiness, that lightheaded feeling in your head, you're using those things improperly. Okay? And that is a classification of abuse. Now, they have a lot of fancy terms for it nowadays to kind of, seems like they're kind of trying to skirt around the word abuse, and they just say misuse and things of that nature, but it's all the same thing, right? So, if you allow yourself to be pressured into abusing or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs, you put yourself at risk to make poor decisions in many other areas, right? Not just that one time where you chose, because even though somebody might be pressuring you, even though someone might be trying to talk to you and persuade you into taking drugs or using alcohol, each individual still has a choice to make, right? Because no one's forcing it down your throat. Underage drinking and drug use are associated with many negative consequences, all right? Many negative consequences. And we're going to look at these consequences, some of these down here, and I'll try to briefly kind of touch on some of the points of these things, some supporting material, which as teachers, we like was mentioned before, we kind of need to have these things in the back of our minds, because this is what's going on in society all around us, right? These are things, these are problems, these are burdens that people are carrying with them on an everyday basis. And some of the very students that you're teaching, they might be going through, maybe not directly, but indirectly, these very things, and seeing these things take place with a sibling, with a friend, or even with the parent or guardian who are experiencing these same effects. But some of the consequences is drug use in later life. Drug use later in life, okay? Being pressured or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs can lead to a consequence of drug use in later in life. William mentioned in the last class, or a class before, gateway drugs. And this kind of made me think about this with this drug use later in life, because there's two things, 2 points I want to make here. But gateway drug, if you just look up gateway drug, it is simply a habit-forming drug that, while not itself addictive, it's a habit-forming drug that, while not itself addictive, may lead to the use of other addictive drugs. Now, the main culprits that are considered gateway drugs are nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana. Nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana, and I believe that was brought out previously. And it says using just one of these drugs creates the risk of wanting to use bolder substances. Now, remember, when people engage in these things, and nicotine and alcohol, marijuana, and so forth, it reacts with the endorphins in the body, the hormone. They call it the feel-good hormone, okay? And you get that euphoria, that feeling that, oh, this is so relaxing. Oh boy, that feels great. And I don't know a person that doesn't like that feeling. Oh man, I hate when I feel so nice all the time. Right? Everybody likes that feeling of just feeling great. Okay? If somebody, a family member or something, does something for you, and you really appreciate it, you have that feeling of being valued and appreciated. You can get that from that as well, especially if you completed a task or something like that. But you get these same things with nicotine and alcohol. That's a positive example. This is a negative example. And it says here, using just one of these drugs creates the risk of wanting to use bolder substances as a teen builds up their tolerance. And that's the point that I was wanting to make there, is that when you start putting these substances in your body, then over a period of time you get a tolerance to it, right? So one pill, which might have made you feel great, doesn't do it anymore. Now you've got to use 2 pills. Now you got to use 3 pills, or 2 drinks, or 3 drinks, or 4 drinks, or bottles, or whatever. Okay, until the point where you're severely taxing your the systems, your body systems. Okay, your vital systems in your body that need oxygen and blood flowing properly and everything else to be healthy for every other one of those systems to function properly. When one is hindered, it affects all the other systems. Okay, same thing with the organs. Kind of like working as a team. Your organs, your systems, they're all a team, right? And if you've got 5 guys carrying 1,000 pounds on their shoulder, right? And if somebody cuts out and is not doing that work, now you've got 4 guys carrying 1,000 pounds on their shoulder. So it went from 200 pounds per person now to 250 pounds per person, or so forth, or hope my math's not off on that. But when one thing is weakened, all the others have to be brought up to speed, have to do more work and so forth. This is the same thing that takes place within our bodies, and it could actually put a greater strain on those organs. Typically, these 3 drugs, nicotine, alcohol, and marijuana, are much easier to get access to than harder street drugs or prescription drugs, or as William mentioned in the previous class, the designer drugs, okay? Designer drugs. Then there's also something with drug use later in life that goes along with this, the law of effect. They call it the law of effect. And tying that in with this drug use later in life, it says the law of effect principle developed by Edward Thorndike suggests that responses closely followed by satisfaction will become firmly attached to the situation and therefore more likely to reoccur when the situation is repeated. Okay? Responses closely followed with satisfaction, that feeling of satisfaction. All right? So you engage in something, right? And you feel great, whether it's drugs or alcohol. When you're presented with that same thing again, yeah, you're more willing to drink. You're more willing to try a drug or a new drug that you haven't tried before. Conversely, if the situation is followed by discomfort, the connections to the situation will become weaker and the behavior of response is less likely to occur when the situation is repeated. And I've heard that said by people in the past. You know, I tried that once, I didn't like it. You know, I vomited, I was sick for days. You know, it was horrible. I never touched the stuff ever again. In fact, I never touched any drugs, or I never drank alcohol, or whatever the case might be, you know, because there was a negative effect that went with that, the trying of that. All right, so one of the things that also is associated with drug use is poor grades. Now, remember, we're talking to about young people here. And, you know, as William mentioned about the, you know, delayed reflexes and so forth, the peripheral vision, you know, your cognition is slow. And, you know, he talked about the different parts of the brain that get affected when alcohol is consumed in great abundance. Well, your grades start dropping. Why? Because your brain is not working the way it's supposed to. You know, your sleep is affected now because you're totally throwing off your circadian rhythm and all those other things that are there naturally when your body's healthy and clean and free of these substances. This is from the National Institutes of Health, and it talks about, it's got a whole list of things, but it talks a little bit here about the effects of alcohol on the brain. And it says, alcohol slows down the chemicals and pathways your brain uses to control your body, altering mood, slowing down reflexes, and affecting balance. It can also contribute to learning, memory, and sleep problems. All right, learning, memory, and sleep problems. Sleep is very, very, very necessary for you to have a healthy body, right? It's a part of growing up, you know, getting a healthy night's rest. In fact, that's what a lot of, you know, medical professionals say, that part or one of the keys to having a healthy body and to have lowered stress levels, lower cortisol, which is a stress hormone that is released from your body, is a proper night's rest, okay? And you see a lot of teenagers, they go through this as they start going through their growth spurts and everything, and, you know, they'll do just fine sleeping 12 or 13 hours a day if you would let them, right? But no, that's not healthy. But you got to get a proper amount of rest. Well, when you engage in this alcohol, it contributes to these problems with your learning, which means it makes it difficult for you to gain information, new information, okay? Not only that, but your memory. So it affects, it creates a problem where now, what little bit you might have gained, you can't hold on to it. Your brain is just like, oh yeah, I saw that. Oh, what's that pretty bird over there? You know, the attention span just gets so short, you know, and other cognitive functions get so damaged that your brain can't function the way that it was intended to. And you think about this with young people, you know, I think it's around about, if I'm not mistaken, about age 8 years old is when kind of there's a great slowdown in the brain cell production of young people. It's phenomenal from birth. And it kind of, if you were to watch a graph, it kind of goes like this, and then it kind of levels off, and it slowly starts to decrease. And with young people, the way you feed those brain cells is with knowledge, with information. And this is why this is the best time to feed your children with this knowledge and information so that it can be stored in their minds. Well, if they don't use it, then those things start to kind of atrophy, so to speak. You've ever seen somebody who maybe was in an injury and they broke their hip or their leg or something, or their arm, or if you've ever done it and you had it in a cast or in traction for weeks or months, well, the muscle starts to atrophy. It starts to get smaller because it's not being used, and you have to build it back up with protein and exercise as well. Well, it's the same thing with our brains. Our brains can actually physically get smaller with less use. Scientific studies have actually shown that the brain of a person who doesn't use it, now everybody uses their brain, but they don't educate themselves. They don't build, they're not feeding their brain. They're not using their brain to make conscious, cognitive, moral choices. They don't have a purpose in life, or they don't see their purpose in life, so they just would rather sit there and rot in front of a television. Their brain scans show very little activity, and they also show that their brain is physically smaller than somebody who is on the other side of the spectrum. Okay, so yeah, you can make your brain fat, fat and healthy, strong and healthy, and contrary to popular belief, having a fat brain is actually beneficial. Your brain likes fat. It loves it very much, along with sugar too. And that's another important thing with self-control. Scientific studies have shown that sugar helps in practicing of self-control. So we have drug use later in life. This can contribute to. Poor grades is another thing. And then we also have a loss of friendships. I didn't get the resource on this one, but this was also a study here on the effects of drugs and relationships. Let me see here. Let me just, there we go. Trying to make the screen a little bit bigger. And it says here, even when someone truly loves you and wants to support you, addiction can become a barrier that seems impossible to overcome. That's true partly because of some of the behaviors a substance abuse disorder can spawn. Some things individuals caught in addiction might do to drive away others include engaging in isolating behaviors. In other words, they start to separate themselves from their family members and their friends, closing more and more of their lives off to family and friends, avoiding family or friends who have commented on or confronted them about drug or alcohol use in the past. Why? Because, like was brought out before, you're old-fashioned. You don't know what's going on. This is fun. This is just a way for me to unwind. There's nothing wrong with spending some time with my friends and going out and drinking at the park or at the beach or wherever. And how many drownings have occurred in those situations? Right? But when someone's corrected about those things or those things pointed out, well, they want to get away from that resistance, right? Because in their mind, they're not thinking this person is trying to, this parent or this teacher or this counselor or brother or a friend, even a true friend, is trying to do something that would protect me, that would help me to see that I'm making poor choices here, but this person is trying to keep me from having fun. That's exactly what they're trying to do. Maybe if you drank a little yourself, you would see what I'm talking about, right? Just trying to keep me from having fun. So they distance themselves away from them. They distance themselves from the very source that would actually help them to see or to distinguish. Remember, we covered at the beginning here, to distinguish between positive and negative influences. Sometimes you need that outside source to help you to see clearly. When you're too close to a matter, sometimes it can be difficult. Some of the other behaviors is lying about drug or alcohol use and hiding it from loved ones, and also stealing from loved ones to help fund an addiction. And that's just some of the things there that can bring about this loss of friendships or put a strain on family relationships, especially when you live in a house and there's only so many people in the house and so many people have access to certain things, and things start coming up missing. Jewelry and clothes and shoes and other things around the house start coming up missing, coupled with kind of suspicious behaviors, trying to hide things or acting odd, or being up or staying late to odd hours of the night. There are telltale signs that, parents and people can look to see if a person is engaged in alcohol abuse or drug use, okay? So we have strain on family relationships. Also, it can lead to premarital sex, which can lead to unplanned pregnancies, STDs, and abortion. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. It was interesting on the statistics on this here. This is from the CDC. Let's see how much time I have. Okay. Yeah, the CDC. And they've done several studies on this, but just got this from cdc.gov. And the topic is on substance use and sexual risk behaviors among youth. Not necessarily, abuse, but substance use, right? And in many cases, these things, as we talked about, falls under the category of abuse, right? Because if it was being used properly, it wouldn't lead to these things. Using things appropriately, things that don't bring harm to your body, don't bring harm to your mind, they're not going to guide you into these risk-taking behaviors. And this research here, they did, it was from the Surgeon General. They had a report entitled Facing Addiction in America. And it says the misuse of substances such as alcohol and drugs is a growing problem in the United States. Although substance misuse can occur at any age, the teenage and young adult years are particularly critical at-risk periods. Well, remember what we've talked about the influences and how impressionable and how people are seeking acceptance. And so when a person is, it's like a person who wants to get a promotion in a company, well, what will you do to get this job as executive vice president? I'll do anything, right? I'll do anything, okay? And sometimes people do anything. Okay, not taking into consideration their morals are also a factor that needs to be considered in the anything that they're willing to do. No, they should always be considering, I'll do whatever is morally necessary to obtain this job. Same thing with our health and our character. It says here, research shows that the majority of adults who meet the criteria for having a substance use disorder started using substances during their teen and young adult years. Drug use later in life ties right back into that first point there. Teen substance use is also associated with sexual risk behaviors that put young people at risk for HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, and pregnancies. The very thing that we're talking about here, which this premarital sex also is a consequence that comes with being pressured or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs. I guarantee you, most young people, if any young people who suffer these consequences, take into consideration any of these things before they engage in these risk-taking behaviors, before they engage in that first drink or that first smoke or whatever the case might be. So it says here, to address these issues, more needs to be done to lessen risk and increase protective factors for teens. Well, the best thing they can do is educate them before they do it. Education is a powerful, very, very powerful tool that when a person knows something and they know the dangers of it, they won't engage it. You think about a child that I've seen parents horrified, because their little toddler who was never taught to be afraid of a snake is running towards mom and dad because look what I found in the yard, and they got the snake by the tail. To them it's no different than a moving belt with eyes, but to the parent they're like, oh, what you got? You got this snake, especially if you're terrified of a snake, they're not taught to be afraid of those. They're not educated to know the dangers of certain types of snakes, right? Well, when you recognize, hold on, don't touch that snake. That's a poisonous snake, or that snake it's non-poisonous. Well, I still don't want to touch it, but it's non-poisonous, right? And so this is the same thing with young people, giving them education and helping them see the consequences, I remember the author saying one time at a conference we had regarding young people, he said, I don't think that it's, young people are deliberately trying to do things to endanger their lives, to be rebellious, to be risk-taking. He said, I just don't think that they consider the consequences of their actions before they do it. If they were to consider the consequences, the majority of them would not do it. Some still would because they have to see it, they have to experience it, right? But the majority wouldn't because they're conscientious and they're educated. They'll see that this can really hurt opportunities for me in the future, including my health, job opportunities and so forth. So let's see here. I don't want to go through this whole article here, but it basically says the same thing in support of the peaceful solution here. That teens are at a greater risk. In fact, this it says of the students who are currently sexually active, it shows showing the risk or the connection between alcohol and drug use and sexual activity. It says 19% drank alcohol or used drugs before the last sexual activity. 29% of high school students are currently sexually active, and 40% have actually engaged in those things. But they show here that drugs and alcohol play a huge part in it. Let's see here. That's all we need on that article. All right. So also, some of the consequences that we see here is violence and aggression. Violence and aggression. Have you ever heard the phrase, angry drunk? That guy's always angry. He's just an angry, drunken person, right? Well, they found that there's a connection between the two. Now, remember these things that we're talking about because these are influence. This alcohol and drugs, they're influences. We're not out of this chapter on maintaining your self-control. Okay, we're still talking about things that we need to do to maintain our self-control. These are things that take away your ability to maintain your self-control. They're influences that are not only physical influences, but they affect the mind. They affect the body as well. They affect the organs and so forth, and things that contribute to the proper, healthy functioning of the mind. But they take away your ability or lessen your ability to make right choices. And if it lessens your ability to make a right choice, you don't have the control that you need to have over your mind, over your thoughts, over your feelings, over your actions. Right? So these are harmful influences when you look at them in the category of positive and negative. When they're used outside of their proper, when they're used improperly. When we say here, the improper use of something is abuse. Well, the World Health Organization, WHO, has found that the use of alcohol is more closely associated with aggressive behavior than any other type of psychotropic substance. But of course, it's different in different people. It says here, interesting note, it says alcohol is involved in half of all murders, rapes, and assaults, said Robert O. Phil, professor of psychology and psychology and psychiatry at McGill University. But the dynamics of this association are complicated. And then they go on to show here that alcohol can provoke different emotional responses for different people. For example, they say here, it can make some people sad and others angry. An interesting note here says if you have a natural tendency to be angry, drinking alcohol may cause you to become more aggressive. All right, so if that's already your tendency, if that's already, a characteristic feature, if that's already a trait that you go back to when something takes place that you don't like, then drinking alcohol is going to take away your barrier, your guard, for you to go, okay, yeah, this is something I don't like, but I can handle this in a better way, right? Let me step away from this. Let me count to 10. Let me go talk to somebody. Let me go out and get a breath of fresh air. No, alcohol is like, get him, rip his arms off, or whatever the case might be. Because you're under the influence of something that has taken away all inhibitions of you making a moral choice. This is why the abuse of these things are so dangerous, right? They're so dangerous. And I'm telling you, as teachers, this is a challenge you're going to face, because a lot of young people, they just don't see what the problem is. I don't see how that's wrong. If I'm in my house and I'm in my own room and I want to get drunk, who cares, right? But how many situations have occurred where people have been in their room, in their own house, got drunk, and they're in some type of intoxicated la-la land, and mom or dad comes in and knocks on the door because they're not waking up, and they wake up thinking somebody's breaking in their house, right? Because they're under that influence, and they become aggressive, or if they have a firearm, shoot somebody or something like that. There's no telling what can occur because you're not in control. And the whole purpose of this is to keep the students where they want to be in control. You should want to be in control, fully in control of your thoughts, your feelings, and actions. So if you have that tendency, alcohol it'll be that grease to help you slide down that angry slide there. And it also, one of the consequences is crimes leading to arrests, conviction, and prison sentences are a result of that. And, the United States has the largest prison population of all the world. I think we're still hovering somewhere around 2.3, 2.6 million people that are incarcerated. And alcohol, like we just read here, it plays a part in 50%, half of all murders, rapes, and assaults. Murders, rapes, and assaults. And a lot of times people, they'll deliberately, before they go and engage in something that is risk-taking, they'll take a drink. Let me quick take a drink. Let me quick get a hit of that bud, or whatever the case might be, right? Because it lessens your inhibitions. Your subconscious mind is telling you, hey, don't do that. That's dangerous. Don't go in there and rob that convenience store. Don't jump off that cliff. Don't go try to beat this person up or do this or do that or drive your car at 100 miles an hour just to prove your car's faster. But the alcohol, the drug says, nah, you go right ahead and do it, buddy. I got your back. It takes it away. It takes away your ability to reason. It lessens it. And that can lead to some of these crimes leading to arrests, convictions, and prison sentences. And lastly there, it says suicide is also one of the consequences of alcohol use. And they found that, at least in the United States, suicide, and I think this was covered in the previous classes, is one of the top leading causes of death in the United States, particularly among young people. And it says suicide can be considered one of the country's most significant health epidemics. It is 10th leading cause of death among all age groups in the United States, and the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 through 34. 10 through 34. Now you think about what's going on in the mind of a 10-year-old that would make them want to end their life. Like I mentioned before, a permanent solution to a temporary problem. In 2016, almost 45,000 Americans died of suicide, with approximately one suicide every 12 minutes. And 1.3 million Americans actually attempted it. Let's see here. I just want to get to this last part. It says, those with alcohol dependence are 10 times more likely than the general population to commit suicide, and those who use drugs are 14 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. So we see that influence there increases your risk of death by your own hands because of, how it makes you feel. People go on these great highs and then they come off that highs and they're in a really deep low. And they've got depression and anxiety and all these things that are building, coupled with anger and the low self-concepts, low self-worth. It just kind of culminates into a big bowl of goo that causes the person to think in their mind, well, what's it all for, right? That's the time when they need help, really. Well, they need it before then, but especially then. It says, additionally, 22% of suicidal deaths involve alcohol intoxication. 20% involved opiates, 10.2% involved marijuana, 4.6% involved cocaine, and 3.4% involved amphetamines. And it says, according to multiple studies, over 50% of suicides are associated with dependence on drugs and alcohol. And at least 25% of people with alcohol or drug addiction commit suicide. Additionally, more than 70% of adolescent suicides are associated with drug and alcohol use and dependence. So we're seeing this, plays a huge part in the demographic that we're working with right here to try to make them aware of, like I said before, these are lifelong consequences that can be had if a person doesn't take into consideration the influences that are being presented to them, whether those influences are positive and negative, and how it's going to affect them later in life. Well, we're going to pick up and continue with this coming full circle next class on continuing on page 142. Our next class is going to be Sunday, the 17th at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Again, we do thank everyone for joining here locally and watching online. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next class. Have a great evening.